What's up, guys? It's Logan. Thank you for stopping in. I'm so excited about this episode. I'm joined by my very good friend Brandon Martin, where we try to cram thousands of years worth of occult history into 1 hour. I hope you guys love it. That's coming up next. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Wizard Factory podcast, where together we explore the universe through ourselves. My name is Logan Hart. If you're new here, or if you're not, hit the bell down below to get notifications every time I'm dropping a new video. Hit the like button as well. Those are like the two easiest and most effective ways to help the channel out, and I really appreciate that. Also, try to watch through to the end. We've got a lot of great stuff to cover in this episode because today, after much waiting and differing kind of schedules and technical difficulties and whatnot, I'm finally joined by my dear friend Brandon Martin. Brandon, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Logan, it's great to be on here. Yeah, I've been looking forward to getting on a show with you for the past couple years, and like you said, we've had some scheduling differences or technical issues, and it's just really amazing to finally be able to collaborate with you on such a amazing platform and amazing show that you have, because I've been following the Wizard Factory for a long time and I've really loved it, really enjoyed everything. I turned people on to it. Wow. And yeah, it's a pleasure, man.
Sure.
Great to be here.
I didn't even know that. I really appreciate you saying that, man. Yeah, super excited to get into this. It was actually quite a task to even decide what topic to land on here, because you're just so knowledgeable about so many things. You've been studying this stuff for a very long time. But and I'm sure we'll probably most likely get you back on, and we can do multiple episodes on different topics here. But today we're going to be talking about the history of the mystery, an overview of the occult traditions, and getting into the historical aspect, and then getting into depth on a few of those as well. So I hope you're excited like we are. Thank you for being here and watching the content. Again, just getting back into the groove of things. So here we go. Without any more chit chat, let's get into it. So Brandon, you've been studying this, as I said, for a very long time, the overall topic of the occult. So I'd love to hear about what kind of got you started on that journey in studying this stuff.
Yeah, my background's pretty interesting. I came from where I was raised. My father was a very rebellious individual, and he was kind of like trying to live his own life. He homeschooled me, and I had access, because of his eclectic knowledge at a certain level, access to occult books such as Manly P. Hall, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, and all kinds of different things that most children would never have to in their libraries. So I got kind of initiated pretty early on, though I didn't start to really find the importance into it until my 20s, because I kind of did what every young person does, is go on their own path, especially in the mid-teens into the early 20s. And then once I hit what they call like the age of enlightenment, which is around like 28 to 32 or 33, when your brain chemistry actually changes, all that stuff that really was programmed into me at a young age, where he was, like reading, for example, he used to read me the Satanic Bible when I was younger. He used to read me the Satanic Witch, just weird things that most kids would never come in contact with. Like most parents would never be like, hey, I'm going to read you Anton LaVey,
Yeah.
So all that stuff started to come to the surface after I had started to do some, internal work and some shadow work, and really dealing with trauma and just getting deep into Jungian psychology and stuff like that. And that's really when I picked up the importance of the occult knowledge, and just went head deep into studying the esoteric traditions. And I had no idea where it would take me, like most of us don't. Like it's a spiral staircase and the destination pretty much. And it's amazing to see how far a lot of us have progressed, including myself. So I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, wow, I can't believe, that I've come this far in such a short amount of time. But my background also is affiliated with the punk community, with skateboarding community. I grew up at a compound called Skatopia, so it was definitely an alternative lifestyle, you could say. And in this alternative lifestyle, I ran into all kinds of people, from all over the place, all over the world. I had people coming from Europe, from China, from all over the place to come stay at my house. So I would run into this kind of multicultural background with everybody. And it really helped me to understand, many different mindsets. And a lot of these people were into different things like thelema, different occult traditions, hermeticism. And they also kind of kicked me in the butt and got me going. But I'd have to say it was really Mark Passio that got me going, and I don't want to like just keep bolstering that he's the guy who did it all, because he wasn't. But watching his work and seeing the professionalism that he had
Mm.
inspired me to go down a professional route with it and to take it seriously, rather than just doing it as a hobby or as something to pass the time. It was something that I was like, oh, wow, like this is, like this is how you take it serious. This is how you can put it out there in a
Yeah.
serious format and really make it conclusive and build this tapestry with it. So that really was like the foundation of me becoming proactive, you could say. So yeah, I have a very interesting background. It's kind of all over the place.
I'll say. No, that's a fantastic answer. And I'm curious if you felt like, so when you were being read these books, from a very young age, did you fully have an appreciation for it at the time, or is it something that kind of after, as you were coming of age and you were starting to kind of rethink and question things for yourself, did you start to kind of come full circle and reinforce those ideas?
That's a really good question. I would say that when I first started to recognize, like what I was being read, I had no idea the overarching importance of it. So, for example, required readings from my dad was like A Brave New World in 1984 or The Hobbit, books like this. Like he was like, you have to read these books. So I read them multiple times before I was, I'd say 10 or 11. And I didn't really know how to apply that to the current world as it was back then. But then I'd say once I hit, 17, that really started to unravel and I could see the connections between those earlier, the earlier knowledge I had gathered and applied it to the environment that I was in and into the world that we're all living in. And so I was really into allegories. I was really into sci-fi. I was really into cyberpunk stuff and things like this, and dystopian movies like Blade Runner. And I was always attracted to these things like Equilibrium, which is a
Oh,
great movie. And it's like I had this kind of intuitive, um, uh, like pathway for myself to get to these things. I was just naturally attracted to these things at an intuitive level. And I really see my awakening was much different than most people. Most people that I talk to awaken right around like 2012,
yep.
or like the 9/11 event, right? Those would be like the two pinnacle places that I hear like people awaken around 9/11 or 2012. Now we're going to have another one which will be, the current last couple years obviously of what we went through. And it's like for me, I was kind of already on that journey way, way early on, and I had already seen through the dogmatic ideas of authority. It's just that I didn't know how to apply all that knowledge I had gained. I didn't know how it could be functional,
Hmm.
is the whole thing. So, and I didn't know what to do with it. It was like I have it, but I don't know what to do with it. So that's kind of how I would answer that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, just thinking back about it's ironic how a lot of young people that have a really good upbringing, because they don't have a lot of life experience, they just can't, they don't have the same capacity to like fully appreciate how good they have it and the good
Mhm.
like information that's being installed compared to other kids their age. until again, it's like once you finally see, oh, this is what you grew up hearing or being told or whatever, and then having some life experiences to compare that off of, that you can fully appreciate like those formative years being fully utilized for you. Do you feel like that was your experience, or did you always kind of have that appreciation?
I definitely feel like that was my experience. I had to grow and develop. I had to do a lot of traveling, not only internally but also externally. So I traveled all over Europe. I traveled all over America, and been to many different countries. And it was because of that that I gained a deeper appreciation for the knowledge that we're going to get into today, and the knowledge that I've gathered over the years. And so, like I said, it was there, but without comparing it to other people's experiences and how they live their lives and how, they've been socially conditioned, or how bad the education system was, and, what, trials and errors that they went through in their own life, that I couldn't really see like, hey, like, oh, wow, I had a pretty decent upbringing, not being socially engineered, didn't have a TV in my house till I was like 15 or 16. It was like, oh, wow, I read books most of the time. I got to live out in the country. I had a skate park in my backyard. It was like, oh, wow, I really did have it made in a certain area. But there was also other things that, other issues that came up with that, right? So there's other tribulations and other cons that come up with that type of upbringing, which is, one of the biggest issues that people bring up about homeschooling is like isolation, right? You're worried your kid doesn't have enough socialization with other children.
Yeah.
For me, it wasn't the case because I was traveling so much and I was just around so many people. But I could see that
Mm.
being the case, and it's not like I don't want to romanticize my upbringing. I had a really good educational upbringing, but as far as like, did I go through trauma? Did I have abandonment issues? Did I have these things that I had to work on in my own life? I had issues. There was issues that all around me. It's just I had a more stable foundation in education, and a good pathway to direct myself, where most people like don't even have that. They have no idea where to look. They just blindly follow what their parents have laid down before them, where their parents have been indoctrinated to the system, and so on and so on and so on. So I even started to question the questioning of the system itself at one point, right? So I was like, maybe I should start to be like one of these kids, because I was like, is this the right way? Because I came from the opposite side.
Yeah.
I was like, should I just start being a normie, just
Yeah.
start following the herd,
The
So for a
pendulum.
time period, I was like, oh man, I maybe I should do that, but obviously that didn't last very
Yeah,
long.
obviously, yeah.
Yeah.
The pendulum always swings, and it's like we're always just trying to find that medium. I definitely resonate with what you're saying. I actually was homeschooled as well, so I did kind of have that isolation in a way. I didn't have the travel and stuff to go with that, so I did kind of have that disconnect, which it took me a while to kind of figure that out in like the high school years to kind of fully socialize and everything. But yeah, it's interesting how the grass is always greener, because it's like you got the good roots, the good foundation, went out and then kind of came back full circle to that. Whereas I had the traditional like Christian conservative kind of upbringing, and I could complain about that, but I choose to see it as that was giving me experience and insight into that psychology, so that now like I can see how far I've come away from that, and I actually feel a lot of gratitude that I did question what I was taught to believe from a young age. And you know yeah, pretty much just seeing that journey there.
That's very mature of you to recognize that. Yeah, I always think, it's so much harder for other people to come out of those conditions. Whereas for me, it was kind of like I had already had a head start a little bit. Not that, like I said, not that I didn't have my own issues to work on, but I definitely had a much easier awakening than most people would have,
Yeah.
but after talking to so many people like yourself, or many, many other people that came from different backgrounds, it's like I can really appreciate that type of gratitude. Like I see that and I'm like, oh, that's beautiful, and it's good because you have knowledge where it's needed. You have experience in those areas more so than some other people might have. So it's a really good way of looking at that.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. Always looking for the more empowering perspective, right?
Right.
So, let's get more into the history of the mystery here.
Mhm.
If you can, and I know like this is quite the undertaking, but if you can give like a brief overview of kind of how the mystery traditions developed from the ancient times and to where we are today.
Yeah, it definitely is a huge topic to cover. So I'd first like to say that I'm no expert in these areas. I've just done a lot of work on this. I mean, this is kind of where I do put a lot of my time now, is into esoteric anthropology and origins. Because origins will really help us to reconcile a lot of the fundamental issues with the dogma that we have running throughout the world, the historical dogma and things like this. So yeah, from my understanding and my studies, I believe that all these esoteric traditions and occult traditions came out of totemic societies in dynastic Egypt, and we can see this in a lot of the text and also the symbolism. And if we study the cultures, we can really start to understand like how all this stuff has evolved out of dynastic Egypt. And it's a really interesting evolution of the occult mysteries, because I know a lot of people have issues with the out of Africa theory, and I have issues with some of it myself. But I also don't kind of fall into the extraterrestrial interference theory either. I entertain that idea, but I also kind of steer away from that, because of this deeper understanding of the importance of the culture and these traditions. So I think these traditions started with the earliest nature cults in Egypt,
Hmm.
specifically in the Nile Valley, and I would refer to these people as the stellar cult, and this would be like the first hero cult. And as far as like a timeline, I could give you an estimate of at least 300,000 years ago that I've traced this to, based on documents from many different renowned authors and scientists and all this stuff. And that's very controversial to put that number there, because a lot of people keep us in the 6,000 year box, or they keep us in like the 30,000 year box with alternative movements. And I'm saying it goes way back before that.
Sure.
And you can understand this with the studies of the cultures and the symbolism. But I would say it moves from the stellar cult into a lunar cult, into a lunar phase. And that takes place about 150,000 years ago. And we can find this as well within the remnants of the anthropology, uh, with the osteoanatomy records, which are like the bone records of the people, and also within the symbolism and the way the culture is evolving, and the way the terrains are being worked with agriculture and things like this. And then we move into what we commonly, most of us know as the solar doctrine or the solar cult, which is what we're living in today, the present moment. And the solar cult is the primary doctrine that we all have. We have the annual cycles of the zodiac, which is based upon a lot of the solar astrotheology and astronomy, right?
Yes.
So and that's what a lot of people base their entire life off of. And it has a lot to do with agriculture as well, because we venerate the sun as the life giver, the bringer of everything, and the energetic force in the universe. And we allegorically look at the sun as a symbolic reference to ourself, as a son of God or as the light of the world. And over time, obviously, it's been corrupted and utilized in many different dark ways. But that's how I would put this. I would describe the occult traditions starting in totemic cultures of early nature cults, of the people who are studying nature, and they have no words to express these things, so they're expressing them in body movement and body language, which became rites and rituals, and they're expressing them through symbolism,
Hmm.
through very basic archetypal forms,
Cave
and they're
paintings.
what is that?
I said cave paintings.
Yeah,
Like same
cave.
idea.
Yeah,
Hieroglyphs,
absolutely.
things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hieroglyphics. And I mean, even just base like a line, like a straight line with another line crossed over top of it. just a cross, right? Just like
Right.
very simple, like two sticks crossed, right? And then it advances to three sticks crossed, and they're trying to build this form of communication. And what they're doing is they're preserving their sciences of nature and of the psychology that they learn about themselves within these modes. And these modes become the occult traditions. These modes become the means for us to evolve the species, to advance ourselves, and to preserve the esoteric sciences. And this science, it's actual real science too. So you have astronomy, you have agriculture sciences, which is where we get a lot of fertility rituals, and we correlate a lot of our psychology in with
Hmm.
the fertility of nature. With the seasons, the planting of the seed
Yes.
in the spring, and the development into maturity, and then on into the fall equinox, and then on and on. It's a simple process, the planting cycles. So then we correlate ourselves to nature, and then it advances. The sciences advance, and with the sciences, as they advance, as we understand more about the natural laws, the mysteries of the universe and of ourselves, the things get more complex and they get preserved in mythology, right? So we get a lot of mythology with this. So a lot of the mythology was a way of preserving the earliest sciences, and we see that even in the Greek mythology, such as with let's say the most basic would be like Zeus with the lightning bolt. He's an allegory for the elemental power of lightning, of electricity.
Right.
So it's a cover for something much deeper. And from there, you can say we move into the modern history, classical history, out of Egypt into the Greek period. And I like to point out that a lot of these are pagan traditions too. And I know that
Yeah.
you're really big into animism, so am I. Pantheistic, naturalistic, paganistic. These are all pagan traditions at some level. And we see a lot of this being carried on with the Druids, obviously, which I would consider to be like the first caravans out of Egypt that's carrying that knowledge into other areas. So like the Druids would be like the high priests that are moving out and exploring other areas. And one thing, I don't want to just dominate the floor here, but one thing I would say about that is just remember that when you're moving out of your sanctuary, when you're moving out of your own territory into new areas, you go into fight and flight, you go into survival.
Yeah.
So you take minimum stuff with you, and you condense all the knowledge that's important into a very simple a mode that you can carry with you throughout the journey. So you don't want to have a whole bag of like a whole library of text with you, right? Not that they had that at that time, but you can't do that. So you're keeping it in a very rudimentary form, but it has the complexity to unravel itself. And that's the great thing about symbolism, is that it just constantly unravels more and more and more. It's fractal, you
Yeah.
know? So you can take a simple circle and it unravels so much knowledge. And that's how they would carry that on into these places of great stress and great, struggles and tribulations for their journey. So I think a lot of people think like, oh, they think they come from it from the mindset of our current day, and it really interferes with like putting yourself in the mind of an ancient person, and the struggles they had with learning these things and
Right.
actually and carrying them on.
That's incredibly profound too, what you said about the compartmentalizing tomes of knowledge into these simple stories, because it's like the saying, a picture says 1,000 words. Well, what is a myth but a verbal picture you're painting with through these kind of archetypes and symbolic figures that contain all this wisdom through the power of allegory? Because it's like, yeah, you could literally just look at a tree and start extrapolating that wisdom from nature. And this is, in my opinion, how all pagan traditions started, was simply by observing nature with the conscious mind and being able to draw those parallels, like you said, a fractal, because that's, in my opinion, what this universe is the one song being sung from infinite instruments of vibration, all kind of saying the same thing but in different ways, essentially.
You nailed it, man.
Yeah.
It's beautiful what you just said.
Wow, thank you.
And yeah, I mean, I think that that preservation method is what has allowed the knowledge to carry itself throughout history, even though it's become fragmented. But the ability to store vast amounts of esoteric knowledge in a simpler symbol is one of the most profound things that we have. And another thing is that, they started to preserve this knowledge in many areas, not just symbols. Like you said, they preserved it in oral traditions, right? They
Hmm.
preserved it in the stars, which were astrotheology, and then it became astrology. And earlier to that was the science of astronomy. So they're studying the stars, and then they start to preserve all this knowledge, and they correlate their psychology to it, and they correlate the
Yes.
movement to their psychology, and they start to see the similarities of the Hermetic philosophy of as above, so below, right?
Yes.
And so below as above, right? So we're seeing that we're not separate from nature is one thing that we're becoming conscious of, because that's one of man's biggest fears, is that we're alone here. We're alone in the universe. This is why we make up all these things to like fill this gap that we have, that we're completely alone. And if we understand that we are a component to nature, we can alleviate that fear that we're just here by ourselves. If we understand we're part of the animal kingdom, we're part of the plant kingdom, we're part of all these things, and we realize we're not really alone. And this is why I love animism, because it gets us away from the religious doctrine of like thinking that all this stuff is just spiritualists, like the animals have no soul, the animals have no spirit, and that's like in the Christian doctrine, you hear this, that the animals have no soul. In certain Christian doctrines, not all of them, and they've changed over the years because it gets complex. But animism is so powerful, and that's why I always enjoyed paganism. So I've always kind of been that way. I've always been a naturalist, you could say. And
Mm.
these things we have to understand that religion, right? Religion had a big role in all this. I know that we can attack religion in the institutions, and we can attack the blind belief, the blind faith in dogmatic religion, right? And what it's become to this day. But all these rites and rituals were kind of the earliest forms of a religious type of, system that we were developing. And I think it's because of that. Manly P. Hall talks about this a lot. It's because of that we actually started to advance and evolve our neocortex, because we were doing these rites and rituals, such as, one I could point out as the ritual of Osiris, but a lot of people wouldn't be familiar with that. But you can see these rites and rituals in the Druids, the Celtics, the Norse mythology, the Norse traditions. I know you're big into the Norse tradition, so am I.
Yes.
I got some Norse symbolism on me right now.
Nice.
Um, yeah, so it's interesting. But as these religions evolved, so this is such a big topic. So I'm trying to do the best I can to navigate and stay oriented here. But as these religions evolved, we started to have these dilemmas with the priest class, and there became a war within the priest class. I would say in the solar aspect, when we started to, let's say, divinize and anthropomorphize the spirits of nature, the elemental powers of nature, where we take something from nature and we divinize it into an actual man that's God, right? And we see this in the Greek tradition.
Hmm.
And then we start to say the sun is actually God, and then that man is actually associated to God. We historicize it, right? The idea of the historical Jesus has a big thing with that. So I'm not saying that there's no historical Jesus either. I'm just saying that there's a danger in historicizing the ideas that are correlated with divinizing a man to that point, and making him a god in our mindset. And this is why the Roman Church has so much power. This is why the papacy has so much power, is because we've historicized Jesus. That's what their whole throne is based upon, is that whole bloodline, that whole tradition,
Hmm.
and the divine right of kings, and so it's really interesting. So my point with like the religious thing is that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because it actually allows us to trace back our origins. So you can't just say all religion is bullshit, just like people say all history is fake, right? It's all fake. And what that gives people to do is abdicate their personal responsibility to look into it. And I'm saying, no, 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 no. It's far more complex and intriguing than that. You need to understand classical history. You need to understand religion, because that's where you're going to trace your heritage. That's where you're going to trace the symbolism. That's where you're going to trace the mythology. the stories, the ideas, all the stuff, right? And you need that stuff to get back to source, you know, because we're not going to be able to deal with the problems of the modern day without dealing with the reasons why they occurred, and that to me is like dealing with origins. So it's a big topic. It's so vast, and I couldn't expect one person to be able to cover it all. And
No, well, you're doing a great
yeah,
job. Appreciate the decisiveness that you're using to kind of touch on these points and tie it all together. So much good stuff in there that I'd love to unpack further. Um, Really great point I thought about the for me, what I think the danger of the historicizing and the anthropomorphizing and that sort of thing is it tends to put too much weight on the symbol than just seeing it as a pointer to the greater whole and the divinity of all things. It's not about Jesus. It's not about the historicity of that or any of that. It's merely an allegory, you know. And you know, I've got my own thoughts on the Jesus figure. Specifically, I agree with what you're saying about not completely dismissing all of it. There's some fundamental reasons that I personally don't work with Jesus as like a divinity kind of archetype personally. You know, as a pagan, I'm going to be the first to say, if that's what works for you, then by all means, who am I to tell you what to do on your own spiritual journey? But me personally, I don't resonate with that particular figure. But, you know, and then like the historicity of that's a whole other topic. Obviously, rabbit trail all day on that stuff. But what I'd like to come back around to here is, so you kind of now painted this overview of how things progressed, and what I'd love to hear your thoughts on what does that actually mean in terms of, okay, well, so who was representing these cults as they progressed, and like, I guess this is kind of part question, part me offering my perspective on it, because I see the occult as being esoteric, meaning the middle of the circle, the bullseye towards truth, and then religions being the exoteric. And much like Mark talks about, sort of like there's real Satanism, and then there's mini-me Satanism, as the powers that be tend to sort of distill their beliefs and their practices out, but in a very watered down and less potent kind of way. So would you agree that, or would you have a different perspective on, you know, is this like the social engineers going back to antiquity as these sort of ideas and practices and traditions are progressing through these phases, and then they're kind of distilling this out to the world at large? Because I think everybody can at least recognize that most people aren't initiated into the ideas or beliefs about the occult whatsoever. So, I mean, where is that kind of line between those practicing this and then the common man, and then tied to this sort of progression throughout the ages?
right. That's a really good question. I agree with you. Religion is an exoteric form of the mystery traditions, and of the esoteric traditions that are the most important. So it's kind of like the manifest. Like I said, it's kind of like a mode that we were using at a certain point to at one point preserve it, but then at another point it's a pathway. It's kind of a slippery slope down into the compartmentalizing it to certain power structures and hierarchies, you know. And that's kind of, I feel, what you're talking about is like the division between what happens when you have this knowledge set into a select group and a select institution, you could say, and what happens to the common man when they can't have access to that knowledge, and how does that divide the species, and how does that prevent us from being able to advance with these esoteric traditions. So
Exactly.
the thing, yeah. So the thing I would say is, well, we have to understand that there was modes for initiation, right? Within the mystery traditions, there was a process, that you had to go through. You have to learn these things. They're rite of passages, right? There's rites and rituals. And as you develop into, let's say, the tribe or the culture or the mini society at that point, you have to go through these certain types of behaviors, and we all know this, right, as a rite of passage into manhood, and it could be different. It's different for each gender. It's different depending on what you're trying to do, uh what you're trying to apply into the world, right? So it's not like, oh, you're just going to be a hunter if you're just a man. Well, no, it's not necessarily that black and white. But the idea is that there was a hierarchical system ingrained into that, because you're not going to understand the complexities of the higher level mysteries without first going through the basics. But the thing was, is they're not preventing you from knowing those things. They're just saying, like, hey, there's a process for you to understand the higher level sciences and the higher level understanding of the occult traditions, just like with anything, right? Like if you want to study any advancements in science, like let's say quantum theory or whatever it might be, trigonometry, something like that, you're going to have to understand arithmetic
There's
first.
prerequisites. Yeah.
You have the prerequisites. So they understood this. So there was this kind of chronology for you to, or process for you to like progress in these things. And then what happened is that got compartmentalized, in my point of view, compartmentalized into these power structures. And then as that happened, they segregated themselves from the common man. And then you get these ideas of the blind belief in authority, and that some of us have the right to rule over other people and occult this knowledge further from the other people who we seem to not be valuable or not be deemed worthy of the knowledge, right? So they're not deemed worthy to have this knowledge. And then you get this big power differential between those who have it and those who do not. So in response to this, then you get a big mob of common people who rush the temples, and then they force the knowledge out of the temples. Okay. So it's an escalation, right? You withhold the knowledge, and then you have a mob that comes in and forces the knowledge out of the temples, and it's a big issue, because you don't know how to handle the knowledge. Imagine if you were like a group. I know you can't be a group, but if you had a group of people and you went to Harvard and you demanded to have PhDs in neuroscience and neurosurgery, and then you took all that knowledge and you got it, and you demanded to have that, and then you went out and tried to perform neurosurgery on people where you had never learned how to handle the knowledge,
Yeah,
So
totally.
that's a big issue. So they're both kind of in the wrong here, right? Because the first thing is that you have to understand there was a reason for the societies to be structured in a certain way. And I'm not saying that it's good to withhold knowledge, because that's not what I'm advocating for. I'm saying that there's a process, like I'm going
Yes.
back to the beginning. You have to have a chronological process of practicing, learning, being able to display, to show that you've learned these
To
things,
earn
right?
it.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
So it's
you have
like,
to, yeah,
it's not that
absolutely.
you
You got
can't
it.
have it, it's just that you
Yeah.
have to earn it. You've got to go through these rites of initiation first.
Right. That's right. And that's the biggest thing. So this is where the first secret societies come about, right? Because this is the idea of, secrecy is repugnant, right? But what makes secrecy um, necessary is even more repugnant. Okay. So
Fair
like
enough.
whatever made right. So whatever made the secrecy necessary for you to withhold that knowledge and compartmentalize it is more repugnant. So when you have the new religions, such as the new dogmatic Christian theology coming forward, and they're warring against all the ancient religions, they're seeking to obliterate all the predecessors, all the nature cults, all the pagan traditions, all the animisms, and anything that ties you back to source and creation and nature, right?
For sure.
um that makes secrecy a necessity at that point. So you have to save the knowledge at some point,
Well,
you
sure.
know
It's almost like just because there's nothing wrong with where you live doesn't mean you want to give your address out to any and everybody. Like you want to have some kind of like privacy about that, because not everybody will use that information in a way that's beneficial to you.
right. So we want to know, like, we're not coming from a place where we had the internet in the past, right? So like this knowledge was always going to be kind of put in places that not everybody can have access to, not by choice, but just by circumstance,
It's
you
almost
know?
like a gun safe or something. It's like it's not that guns are evil, it's just you want to make sure they're safe from like children who would not know what they're doing and end up hurting themselves or someone.
Absolutely. So this is the thing. I don't have issues with a lot of the ancient secret societies, right? I think that's the reason why we have the knowledge today is because these secret societies were actually endeavoring for the benefit of the species. I have issues with the religious dogma that has taken the knowledge that was preserved by the secret societies and the ancients before that, and perverted it and inverted it or obliterated it or assimilated it. Such as the Roman Catholic Church. That's one of their main modus operandi is to make sure that all the knowledge that is uh, that is contending with their authority, with their structures, with their narrative is done away with or used in a way that bolsters them, so it has to be used for their own agenda. So, it's the old thing, they warred on the Gnostics, they warred on the pagans. After the Council of Nicaea, we had Christians killing Christians. We had people going out and killing Gnostics. We had people going out and obliterating all pagan traditions after the Council of Nicaea. So, and it started before this. That's just a good example of that, right? And then you have the mob, right? You have this mob that goes out and they burn the Serapeum and they burn the Alexandria Library, the Temple of Osiris. They burn all these places with all the knowledge that actually is beneficial for them to gain freedom, to gain reconnection to nature.
Isn't
So
that
they just did
ironic
this.
though?
Yeah, it's so ironic, right?
Ignorance of man. It's yeah.
Right, right.
That's probably one of the greatest tragedies in our history is the loss of that knowledge, to be honest. It really
Absolutely.
just, my heart hurts every time I think about it. That's crazy.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing into that.
Okay.
Is that it's only in the past like 100 years that we've had the ability to, put together all this knowledge of the ancient past. It's maybe if you're lucky in the past 200 years, but it's mainly in the past 100 years that we've been able to reconcile all these fragmented pieces from all over the world. Of this ancient knowledge that gets us back to our original, traditions and an original understanding of nature and ourselves and a way and living in harmony with natural law, obviously. And that's why the mysteries are so important and understanding origins is so important because it allows you to trace back to when this happened and it also allows you to trace back why it happened, why these ideas became corrupted. And so it's a big thing. I think it's amazing topic. I'm really happy to be on here because we hear this in little bits and pieces on the network and
Yeah.
on the other people's pages, but we don't really get to talk about this stuff much. So I'm kind of excited to talk about
I'm
it.
loving it, man. I'm already can tell we're gonna have to have you back on and just continue to dive into this stuff because I think we're only literally on like the second question out of this list.
Right, right.
I was way
I knew
too,
that was gonna
my
happen.
eyes were bigger than my stomach for that because it's like, I want to just talk about all the things. I love it. This is great. So, yeah, one thing that was kind of coming up for me as you were describing this progression again is how it went from the roots and the origins in paganism when civilization was so much smaller. It was tribal. It was just villages where everybody knew each other. And so that rite of initiation was something probably most everybody went through as just a part of becoming an adult and kind of being initiated as they're coming of age. And then as civilizations became bigger and more anonymous and disconnected, I could see that that's where the knowledge started to become more compartmentalized and elevated above the common person, where it was more ingrained in entrenched in the power structures. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the issues that we see is the struggle of the exoduses out of the areas and what that means, and then also the evolution of, you know, it's a it's a very complex thing, because when you're in a sanctuary, that's where growth is going to take place because you're not in survival mode. So, like, that's the thing. So, we have to ask, why did the growth stop taking place within the sanctuary? So we have to ask, like, what happened within the area where evolution was taking place, where the sanctuary was, healthy? What happened within that to actually create that hierarchical power structure? Because like you said, it was cooperative, it was co-created, and everybody had access to it, and it was part of the natural way of becoming an adult in these smaller areas. And as we advanced, the technology advanced and things like this, the knowledge became disconnected from that. And then you get religious belief systems and religious institutions that start to develop because of that. And then you see where we're at today, obviously, with one of the main power structures in the world being the papacy, obviously. So it's extremely advanced, and your questions are on point. And these are the questions that I want to hear more from people. I want to hear more of these questions from people, because these are the things you don't, most people can't even deal with. They can't put it on the table. And we're part of the Knights of the Round Table here. I mean, that is the hero myth as well, the Arthurian legend, and it preserves a lot of this knowledge as well. So we got to put whatever we have on the table and field it. We got to say, okay, this is important. Let's deal with this right now. So I agree with that assessment. Yeah, getting back to your question, I think that's an accurate assessment at a certain level. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more, and yeah, just definitely enjoying getting into these topics here. The the next question I have that kind of relates to this, and we've touched on it a little bit, but I'm sure the viewers here already have an idea of where I stand on this, but I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of comparing the pagan versus the more Abrahamic sort of rooted traditions, where personally, I would even say something like the Norse traditions would be its own kind of occult tradition in a way. There is so much wisdom, and of course, with the syncretistic mindset, the truth is persistent. It has no borders. It's parallel. So anything is going to be consistent throughout. But I personally think that the Abrahamics are a weaponized form of this knowledge that are kind of running this mind virus, where people are thinking that they're getting to the root of it, and there's of course a lot of truth built into it, but there's something that's misaligned and could be stunting the magic of that individual.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Abrahamic religion and Abrahamic thought is one of the main issues we're facing, and it's like what you said. It's a mind virus,
Real quick for
And
clarity too.
yeah,
Sorry to interrupt you, but just
you're
people
good.
understand, I'm not just talking about like Christianity,
Mhm.
Muslim, and the Jewish faith systems themselves, but even things like Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, things that are rooted in that, even but from the more esoteric aspect.
The mystery traditions with the Abrahamic, even in Freemasonry. I have a
Yep.
Freemason logo behind me. I'm not a member, but I do support the original traditions and the esoteric teachings beyond the corruption, obviously. But I agree with you. I think that well, one thing I'd like to say is that the Norse culture, they are one of the most robust cultures, and they had firewalls set up against Christian infringement upon their traditions and upon their mythology and upon their sacred sciences and mythology. And that's why we see that their traditions are so pure today and kept intact, because they're so robust,
Hmm.
and they stood against that very vigilantly. And we see that in other areas too. Like, and we don't ever hear about this. So, like in the Japanese cultures, right? A lot of people don't talk about the Eastern cultures too much, but they actually had laws set up against all forms of religion, including Buddhism and Shintoism. So, like, the Japanese would not allow any form of Buddhism or Shintoism into their country, and they were very robust with keeping their traditions intact. And if you look at their mythology, it's very similar to the Norse and to the Egyptian mythology, because it's all rooted in the same thing. Ultimately, they're all lining up, like you're saying, with the truth. Um, so yeah, I think it's one of the biggest issues is the Abrahamic traditions, just like any good master manipulator. They know how to take the truth and twist it and add their own poison within that. You know, they know how to take it and poison your worldviews because of that. And yes, I agree that it's been absolutely weaponized. And the only reason that I see it's important is as a fragment to trace back to the more pure forms and the more pure traditions if you need it. Some people might not need it, but let's say, you know, that's where you're advanced in is the Abrahamic traditions. Well, you may be able to pull out some really deep esoteric sciences
Mm.
from it if you can get beyond the dogma, which is a hell of a task. It's extremely, you know, bagged down. You know, there's a bunch of weight there. So I'm not saying do that, you know, but I'm just saying you can pull out some stuff, but I'm not advocating for it. But yeah, I agree with you. You know, it's been weaponized. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things like, sure, you could extrapolate a lot of really profound wisdoms there, but as I like to say, you're drinking from a poisoned cup. You're better off just
Yep.
finding a pure water source and not sitting here like, but this is drinkable water. I just have to filter and distill and purify all this crap. And, you know, but
Yeah, you
why
don't want to do
bother?
that.
Just go to a better source. And as I say, the way to do that is to find traditions that have an unbroken connection all the way back to the pre-Christian era. That's why I
Yep.
would classify the Norse, and that's the one that I most resonate with from a genetic level and just philosophically. I really appreciate that, and that's part of it. That actually kind of leads me into the next question that I wanted to ask you, Brandon. Is you said that you see kind of the mother of all these mystery traditions going back into very, very ancient Egypt. How would that coalesce with the idea of where, say, the Indo-European traditions that branched off from, you know, the Norse and the Hindu, say, for example, that sort of have that same Indo-European mother philosophy that kind of branched
Mhm.
off? How does that coalesce into this idea of the ancient history of the Egyptian and also
Mhm.
maybe the Sumerian? Because as I understand, Sumeria may have predated Egypt, or am I totally wrong on that?
A lot of people do say that, you know, Samaria and like Mesopotamia is like the cradle of civilization, right? So a lot of people do say that. I take, you know, like I take a step back from that personally, just because of like what I've studied with the stellar and lunar. But when I talk to people about this tradition of Egypt, I always say you have to go through Europe to get to this because you will find, let's say, for example, you're going to find the most amount of intact mounds from the mound builders in Europe. You know,
Mm,
you're going to find those traditions in the mounds in Europe where the rites and rituals are being practiced and the agriculture and the architecture is being advanced in Europe. So it's a very hard question to answer, but I would say that with the exodus that take place out of Egypt, they go north and they go into the north regions, okay, in the northern regions, and from there they start to you know, colonize, if you want to say. I don't like using that word, but they start to migrate to the northern regions of Europe, and then from there they plant and they create these very robust sanctuaries in those areas, and this is why we see so many mounds in those areas. And then eventually the church comes in and builds over those mounds with their cathedrals, because that's one of the things that they do, right? They come in on the sacred sites and then they build over it to overlap those traditions
yes,
symbolically and, you know, pragmatically for their agenda, right?
of
It's not
course.
pragmatically for us obviously, but for their agenda it works great. But that's what I would say. To get back to what I'm talking about, you have to go through Europe. You got to go through the Norse traditions. You got to go through anything in Europe. And Europe has an amazing, um, robust, and one of the most well preserved libraries in the world, right? And I'm not just talking about like one library. I'm talking about just their literature alone is so amazing.
Mm,
The historical literature is some of the most advanced, right? They're so precise with keeping accurate history, you know, accounts and things like this. And you know, everybody wants to go into history is all fake, you know, and all that stuff. And I'm like, no, no, no. There's There's a lot of important knowledge there that you have to understand. You got to, the way I look at it is you got to learn classical history. And then if you want to say it's all fake, then you can come to me and tell me that it's all fake after you can demonstrate that you've learned classical history pretty well, you know? Before you can tell me it's all fake and convince me of that, you better demonstrate that you know history, you know?
Yeah,
Um, so I know that a lot of people, you know, like I said at the beginning, take a step back from the out of Africa thing. And I think the way that you can trace that is just by the rites and rituals, like what you find in the Norse traditions, what you find in the European traditions, what you find in even the Japanese traditions. You're going to find earlier on in the early Nile Valley totemic traditions. So I would say look into totemic sociology of Northern Africa and look into like the totemic hero cults. And I can recommend a couple sources for this right now. And I would say
sure.
look into Albert Church Ward would be one person I would look into. Alvin Boyd Kuhn. I would look into John Anthony West as well, who's a renowned Egyptologist. And he bases his work off of another guy that I would recommend, who's R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch. I think I pronounced his last name right. His last name is kind of hard
That's
to
a
pronounce.
fancy name right there.
Yeah, yeah, and I believe he was French, but he's amazing. You know, he did the Temple of Man. He wrote the book The Temple of Man, and he shows how all the architectures are based off a lot of the anatomy and a lot of the biological advancements we were making in the past, and how the temples are actually structured like men. And you walk into the heart chamber, and there's all this science of the arteries and the cardiology, right? So
Mm,
it's really amazing. Um but yeah, I would say those guys, and then another person who's not initiated but is very important would be Gerald Massey. Gerald Massey would be like extremely important, and his work is extremely deep and hard to get through, but it's worth looking into. So yeah, I mean, and you know what? I'll just say this too. I entertain all these ideas. I'm not like strict, like, oh, this is the only idea that can be, right? This is just where my research has led me over the years. And I've looked into a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff. And pretty much whatever people have brought to the table in front of me, I've looked into it almost. I'm not saying I know it all, but I'm saying that I've looked into a lot of stuff over the years, and especially when it comes to origins. So if you haven't dealt with, and I'll say this here, if you haven't dealt with totemic sociology and like esoteric anthropology, then I don't think that you're really that qualified to understand where the origins are. So you have to look into those things a lot. And a lot of people do. I know you've looked into esoteric anthropology because I know I've heard you talk about it. Maybe not those words specifically, but I know you've talked about the Norse and the pagan traditions and some of the roots of those. And I really enjoyed that. Um, so I would just say that's for the mature students. Esoteric anthropology and totemic sociology are for advanced students who are really ready to get there,
oh yeah.
to get dirty.
Yeah.
You better be ready to get dirty, because it gets confusing, because history is ambiguous.
Mhm.
That's the thing. History is ambiguous, and you can rewrite it any way you want because of the ambiguity as you go further and further back. As you go further and further back in history, there's less written text, less chroniclers, people who are chronicalizing, all the events, and which makes it easier for you to wrap it around your own narrative. So you got to be careful about that. We have to be very cautious about, like, we can take this, and because there's lack of information in textual form, we can wrap it around what, and it's not like some people do it intentionally, some people don't. you know it's
For
just
sure.
open for interpretation is the way you could look at it, right?
Right. And thank you for saying that. I think that's so absolutely vital, in my opinion, to not be too rigid on your ideas about things, especially on matters such as this, that at the end of the day, nobody really knows with a capital K what happened, thousands of years ago. We have ideas, and it's great to study and form your own opinions, but not become dogmatic about it. And
Hmm.
but especially with you mentioning the people that just say history's all fake, that's such a, yawn, like that to me is such a intellectually lazy stance to take on something, to exonerate yourself from having some responsibility for using discernment and actually having, you know,
Mhm.
real opinions about something. It's easier to just say, "Oh, everything is a lie," "NASA's a lie, everything's a lie." It's like,
Right.
that's such a one-trick pony kind of approach to it. It's like, of course, we're being lied to about a great many things, but it's our job to figure out which of those things it is and not just all throw it in the same basket and,
Mhm.
sail it down the river, like that's just that anti-scientific mindset that has become all too pervasive in the modern world for sure. It's like it's way easier to just kind of take the easy way out than look into it, form your own opinions, and have some discernment about it.
Absolutely. That's why I love discussions like this, because it's like, put it on the table. I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Hmm.
Like, let's get Graham Hancock in here and see what he thinks. Whatever it might be. Right. I'm
Yeah.
not necessarily I agree with that guy all the way,
Yeah, I
but
sent him an
it's
email, but he never got back to me. No, I'm just kidding.
right.
We'll see.
But it's like it's like, we have a lot of people looking into these things now, so we're gonna have to deal with it in a mature way, and it's not going to be an easy endeavor, because it's going to be combative to all of the preconceived notions about history throughout all time, pretty much, throughout classical and modern era, and
Mm,
modern history. So it's going to combat all the religious ideologies, because they're going to try to keep you in that loop of the divine right of kings and the historical Jesus and all this stuff, which has to keep you in that kind of 6,000 year box. Then you get into alternative groups, which will, like Graham Hancock, they're going to take you back into Egypt 30,000 years. And they're going to say, the Great Flood, the deluge, and all this stuff. And then you're going to get into other people who are going to be like extraterrestrials, interference theory, and then that may take you back that long. Some people don't even say it's that far back. So it's like, and you got to go through all that stuff, is my point. You have to deal with those things at some level, and then when you've dealt with it, then you can start to really see like the importance of the culture, because the way that you're going to understand these things is by studying the culture. You have to study the cultures and the way the cultures have evolved, because you're not always going to find biological evidence for it. You're not always going to find archaeological remnants of it. You have to study the culture, the ideas,
mm,
and follow them throughout history, and that's done through the symbolism, because they're very simple symbols, yet they're so profoundly, like we were talking about earlier, so profoundly fractal with how much they can mean and what they can be applied to. So those rudimentary runes are so powerful, and I look at them as like
mm.
some of the most ancient stellar, uh like some of the most pure forms. And so I think the Norse people are remnants of the stellar cult, and they're keeping it intact.
Wow.
That's how I look at the Norse. I think that they're some of the people, just like the Druids, or some of the others I would say is like the Japanese. Some of their mythologies, you find that stuff in. Like if you look at their characters, like kanji. If you look at their kanji characters, they're very similar,
Mm,
and they mimic nature. They're not like our American alphabet, the English alphabet, not just American, but the English alphabet.
sure.
But yeah, not that there isn't knowledge in the English alphabet, which I talked about in my presentation, but that I just did at the conference, the funnel conference. So
Absolutely. Everyone definitely needs to check that out. I'll put a link in the description so everybody can watch that if you're interested on green language and that. Amazing. Uh, Maybe the symbolism stuff can be something we get into next time because that's definitely another topic that I love. And man, we could definitely get down the rabbit hole on that one for sure.
I bet so.
Oh, yeah. Brandon, man, I could talk to you for hours, brother. Think time to wrap this one up. I think we've really covered a lot of good ground here. Very interesting, and you've given a lot of resources now for people if they want to take this on their own investigative journey and take this further with themselves. So if you'd like to go ahead and tell people where they can find you and get into more of your work.
Yeah, you can find my work on my website, seedtruth.com. And you can also find it on the One Great Work Network. You can go to the creators page, and then I'll be right there at the top, Brandon Martin. And you can also find me on YouTube under Seed Truth Academy. But yeah, I mean, I'd say those are the three main places. I'm on Discord or Odyssey and BitChute and stuff like that. And you can find all those links in the seedtruth.com website. And then also you can find my podcast where I co-host with Nathan, called The Cubby Hole. And you can find that at cubbyhole.com, CUBBYWHOLE.com. So we have a new episode coming out, I think tomorrow, actually. So,
Nice.
it should be pretty good. Beyond green language and symbolism and synchronicity. So, really
Cool.
excited about that. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone do go give Brandon a follow. He does amazing work. He's been in the game way longer than I have, so a ton of respect for you and the stuff that you've put out, man, over the years. Those links will all be down in the description for your convenience, so do check those out. Thank you for watching. I hope you've gotten some value out of this. If you did, again, just hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it really helps me out. And subscribe and hit that bell so you catch all the new videos coming out. Very excited about the stuff in the works here. Also, the website is now revamped and live again and fully furnished with a brand new shop full of merch designs that I came up with. So definitely check those out. I'm very excited about that as well. So that's going to wrap us up for this week. Thank you again for watching. And until next time, be empowered, be inspired, and be encouraged.